Exodus chapter 17. And interesting subject that the Bible goes into, or rather a change of course, if you will, in this chapter. Of course, what we covered this morning in the service before that was just how Israel again is in this place where they're tempting the Lord. Even questioning if God's even anywhere around them. And what we saw this morning, what a statement that was, because God had been feeding them every single day with manna. A pillar of a cloud by day, a pillar of a cloud by night. I mean, all these things were around them every day, and they still came to the place where they said, is God even here? Is God even among us? And then that's what we saw in verse number 7, in Exodus 17, verse 7. But the very next verse says this: Then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. So this is the same place where they're at. Well, let's just read a little bit. And Moses said unto Joshua, Choose us out men and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. So Joshua did as Moses had said to him, and fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy. And they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon. And Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side and the other on the other side. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. Joshua discomfited Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And the Lord said unto Moses, Write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. For I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called the name of it Jehovah Nissi. For he said, Because the Lord hath sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Now, as we're reading through this chapter here, I got to remind myself that there's someone working behind the scenes that's not mentioned here. And he has been working behind the scenes throughout the book of Exodus and throughout the book of Genesis. And I'm not talking about God working behind the scenes or someone else that really wasn't mentioned until, Genesis chapter 3. It was the last time I think he might have been mentioned there. And who is this person that I'm talking about that's working behind the scenes? I believe it's Satan. And I realize Satan he's not even mentioned in this chapter. He's not even mentioned. But I want to bring that out in a little bit. But we got to remember, Satan has and will always have an ongoing assault against God's people and against God. And somewhere among these 2 million Jews, there's a promised seed of the Messiah. And I'm persuaded to believe that Satan has an ongoing attack trying to destroy the promised seed of the Messiah. Now, we remember in the first part of Exodus, Pharaoh was executing all those children to prevent a deliverer from coming. There may have been a dual purpose that Satan was out to also get rid of the Messiah through that. I don't know. But here we do see Israel being attacked. And in verse number 8, and the time that we find them being attacked is at their most vulnerable point. And so as we look at this text tonight, I want us to look at Satan's strategic attacks. And again, one thing that I've noticed about the devil that we can see in the scriptures is that he works behind the scenes. I mean, folks, he can be working in a situation and you don't even realize he's anywhere around until you've been attacked and you look back at all the damage and you think, the devil was in this. The devil was in this. And so I think that's a pretty accurate truth, that Satan seems to work behind the scenes, unnoticed, unknown. Now, he's not mentioned here, but let me remind you what the New Testament says in Ephesians 6. If you will, let's turn to Ephesians chapter 6. Hold your place in Exodus 17. But Ephesians chapter 6 and verse number 12 gives us this spiritual truth. God opens up our eyes to the reality of our warfare, or the things we deal with in life. Ephesians 6 verse number 12 says that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. So who's flesh and blood? Just who's that? Everybody. That's us. So our warfare, our battle, he's saying it's not against your fellow man. It's not against flesh and blood. But what God is saying here, really it is against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So the Bible's telling us that our warfare, your warfare, my warfare is ultimately against spiritual wickedness in high places. So when I look in Exodus 17, I see that there's a battle going on between the Israelites and the Amalekites, and I can't be so nearsighted as to say, well, it's just a disagreement that's going on between these two people. I need to realize that there's someone behind the scenes working, orchestrating, manipulating, whatever, working in people's hearts to bring about this battle. And I'm persuaded it's the devil. And there's another thing that we can see, another truth that we saw in Ephesians, but it's an obvious truth, that Satan works through people. He works through people. And a sobering truth is, do you know what kind of people the devil uses to accomplish his will? Anybody. He uses people like you. He uses people like me. He uses lost people. He uses saved people. That's why the Bible tells us to be sober. Be vigilant. Why? Because your adversary, the devil, walketh about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. We've got to keep our eyes open. We need to be careful about this thing, because Satan is looking to manipulate people and to use people to bring about his destruction. That's what he's doing. So Satan works behind the scenes. Satan uses people. But what we find in Exodus chapter 17 is Satan works on both sides of the line. You say, what do you mean? Well, I think the devil was not only working on the Amalekite side, but I think he'd already been working on Israel's side to bring about this war. What do you mean? Well, Satan, he'd already been working in the Israelites' hearts to weaken their faith through unbelief. Remember, that unbelief, that they started out with a strong faith there after they crossed the Red Sea there. But this is just a few weeks later, several million of these Jews here, and now they're at a place where they're full of unbelief. And we said that unbelief had to start in one person's heart, and then it spread to all of them. And the verse we used was a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. Somebody let the devil in, if you will. And then it spread to another person, and to another person, and to another person. So this unbelief was working in people's hearts, and I hope I'm not giving the devil too much credit than what he deserves, but the Bible says we're not wrestling against flesh and blood. So I think he's putting these, he often puts these ideas of unbelief in our minds. If not the devil himself, some devil. So Satan had already worked to produce that unbelief in their hearts. But also Satan had been working to distance the children of Israel's relationship with God. Because when the children of Israel sinned by tempting the Lord, what did that drive between them and God? Distance, a wedge. See, this is part of Satan's strategy. Discourage you, bring you to a place where you don't believe God, bring you to a place where you don't trust God, and then to bring you to a place where you commit sin, so now you're distanced from God. So we can see that going on in the Israelite camp, but then on the Amalekite side, Satan's working in his heart to go to war with the Israelites. And I think it was, here Amalek, he sees this multitude of Jews coming out of Egypt. They've been out there for a couple months now, and it's just an easy spoil for him. They don't, they're hungry, they don't have a lot, they're desperate, they don't have, there's not an army established. So he sees them as, this is an easy kill. I heard, they spoiled the Egyptians, so there's no telling what kind of lust motivated him. But he went to war with them. So Satan's working on the Israelite side, he's working on Amalek's side, and it's interesting that Amalek is a descendant of Esau. And we can see that in Genesis 36:12. Amalek, so they're distant cousins. And what we see in verse number 8, it says, after the children of Israel at that place, it says, then came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. What's going on here? Is Satan, or rather Amalek, ambushes the Israelites. You say, wait a minute, I don't see that there. Well, look in 1 Samuel chapter 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15. And we'll start in verse number 1. And Samuel's just giving instruction to King Saul. And remember one of the early battles that Saul was to go up against was the Amalekites. And notice what the Bible says about the Amalekites. It's in verse 2, but let's pick up in verse number 1. 1 Samuel 15:1. It says, Samuel also said unto Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint thee to be king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken unto the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts. And look what God said in verse 2. I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. What's that mean, that Amalek laid wait for the children of Israel? He ambushed them. See, we're talking about Satan's strategy here. He's working behind the scenes He's working in people's hearts. He's got the children of Israel sinning against God. They're distanced from God. They're tempting the Lord. They're full of unbelief. And He's working on the Amalekite side. They're lying in wait. They're going to ambush Him. He thinks it's going to be an easy kill for him. And so, if you can think back in your Christian life, does Satan ever work in your life like that? He gets you down, defeated, discouraged, away from God, tempting the Lord, unbelief. You've sinned, you're distanced, and it's at that time he ambushes you. That's exactly what we see going on here in Exodus 17. The whole nation, they're defeated, if you will, spiritually, and it's at that time that the Amalek chooses to ambush them. That's the right time to do it. And that's exactly what Satan does. He ambushes us when we're weak. But Israel had a defense. And this is just the mercy and grace of God. And I'm so glad that when we're defeated spiritually, we're distanced from God, God doesn't desert us. He doesn't leave us or forsake us. And He doesn't allow us to be defeated by the enemy. Yes, we may fall, but I'm so glad God picks us up many times. He picks us up. Look what happens here in Exodus 17. And Israel's defense is they had some men there that God used. And I want you to look and see just what kind of men God used in Exodus 17. It says in verse number 9, Moses said unto Joshua, choose us out men, and go out, fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in mine hand. So Joshua did as Moses had said to him and fought with Amalek, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. So the first thing I can see, what kind of men did God use? He just simply used willing men. Moses said, Joshua, go out and choose some men. They were chosen men. But these were men that they were at least willing to stand against the enemy. Folks, if we don't have men that are willing to stand against the enemy, what hope do we have? There's got to be some fight in you. Don't belly up and roll over. Have some fight to stand for what's right. Now, how skilled in warfare were these Israelites? What had their previous training been? Somebody tell us. Slaves. They weren't soldiers, they were slaves. And now they're tasked with going to fight Amalek and his people, the Amalekites. They don't have any experience. They're not skilled. But at least they were willing. God uses willing men. And you know what? I'm so glad for this. God makes up the difference. I think that in pastoring. Man, I don't know what I'm doing. I just think so many times God makes up the difference. And He's got a lot to make up. Amen's right. I'm not ashamed to admit it. He makes it up. But God uses willing men. And these men Moses was willing. Consider, from Moses to Joshua, Aaron, Hur, all the men that Joshua chose, they were just simply willing men. Nothing fancy about them. They were just willing. Because what we find about this men, not only were they willing, but there's something about them, is they were weak men. Moses was old. He's 80 years old. And what we find in verse number 11, not only was Moses, Moses was weak, but verse 11 says, came to pass when Moses held up his hand. Here he is, he's standing on the hill. He's holding up his hand. I kind of get the visual, Israel's down in the valley fighting against them. And I don't know if they looked to Moses and it was an encouragement. I don't know, but he held up his hand, and when he did that, Israel prevailed. But Moses, he was weak, and the Bible says when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. So Moses was a weak man. And not only that, but the soldiers were weak. So God used willing men, but these were just simply weak men. Well, guess what? That's the kind of men God uses. Men were fighting, weren't skilled. They weren't soldiers. They were slaves. The men were weak, but their leader was weak also. But these were men that took the initiative. There was a group of men that said, you know what? When Moses' hands get weak, then we start losing. So what did they say? What did they do? Prop it up. Well, who told them to do that? Nobody did. They took the initiative. Something inside of them said, ding, ding, light bulb. This is what we need to do. We need to help him out. If we're going to win this thing, we need to help him out. So Aaron and Hur, they went up there and they held up Moses' hand, one on the right side, one on the left, and they prevailed. They won. What a blessing that is. They're men that took the initiative. They didn't sit there and say, well, Moses is tired. I don't know what we're going to do. I guess we'll go from being Israelite slaves to Amalek slaves. We'll just lose this one. They said, no, not today. We're going to go and help him out. So here's just a simple lesson. We'll be short tonight. But they gave Moses, they gave him a stone to sit on, so they gave him rest. They propped up his arms. They gave him the support that he needed. So here's a great lesson that God was teaching Israel that way, and that day. And you can think about this, that when Amalek came against Israel, all God had to do was, he could just breathe on them, they fell down dead. But he didn't. He let the people go to war with Amalek. Well, why did God do that? He had to have been teaching them some kind of lesson. How about the lesson of helping each other out? I think so. What we'll find in this lesson is the congregation and Moses worked together, of course, with God, to get the victory. It's interesting that at this time you don't find them murmuring and complaining. Give them that. At least they came together. So what a lesson that is. And I just want to throw that out there to us this evening. God uses willing men. God uses weak men. He uses men that take the initiative. And that's what he did in that congregation. And you know what? I don't think it's any different in our day today. I don't think it's any different in our church here at Midway. I think there's truths that we can apply to our church. I'm not saying there's not a unity here, but the truth is, when you guys, I know this. I hope you don't see this as my own benefit. But if you guys are supporting me and I'm supporting you, we're working together. And God gets the victory that way. See that? God gets the victory that way. It's a win-win. So I hope that's some encouraging words for you folks. Let's stand and we'll dismiss in prayer.